Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that echoes across millennia. How does a people survive when their homeland vanishes? When exile becomes not a temporary hardship, but a permanent condition lasting generations, centuries, thousands of years? The Jewish diaspora represents one of history's most remarkable stories of persistence, a tale of communities scattered from Babylon to Brooklyn, maintaining identity through sheer force of will, faith, and collective memory. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. I'm always curious whether you're settling in for the night or listening during the day. If you remember the founding of Israel in 1948, or if you've heard stories from family members about Jewish communities in Europe before the war, I'd especially love to hear your perspective down below. Your generation witnessed history that shaped the modern world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine being scattered across every corner of the globe, your home a distant memory, your culture a whispered secret passed down through generations. For thousands of years, one people faced exactly this reality. Kingdoms rose and fell, empires conquered and crumbled. Languages evolved and died. Yet somehow, against odds that would have erased any other ancient people from history, Jewish communities maintained their identity, their faith, and their connection to a homeland many had never seen. This wasn't a simple story of exile and return, though that's how we sometimes reduce it. This was a complex, centuries-long odyssey involving countless communities navigating vastly different circumstances. A merchant family in medieval Toledo faced entirely different challenges than a farming community in 19th century Ukraine. A scholar in Babylonian exile had little in common, practically speaking, with a survivor rebuilding life in post-war America. And yet, thread by thread, generation by generation, they remained connected to something larger than themselves. Those of you who remember the late 1940s might recall the newsreels, the grainy footage of ships arriving in what was then Palestine. Survivors of the Holocaust, stepping onto land their great-great-grandparents had left 2,000 years before. It seemed impossible then. It still seems impossible now. How does that happen? How does memory survive that long? The answer lies not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, though those certainly occurred. The answer lies in the quiet, daily acts of cultural preservation. A father teaching his son to read Hebrew, a mother lighting Sabbath candles in a cramped apartment thousands of miles from Jerusalem, a community gathering for prayer when the synagogue was illegal, when assembly itself invited persecution. Small acts repeated endlessly across countless communities scattered like seeds on the wind. Tonight, we're going to trace this extraordinary journey from the first great exile in Babylon through the medieval dispersions, from Enlightenment challenges to modern returns. We'll examine not just what happened, but how it felt, how communities adapted while refusing to disappear, how they balanced assimilation with identity. This is history, yes, but it's also a story about the stubbornness of memory and the power of collective purpose. 586 years before the Common Era, the Kingdom of Judah, already weakened by internal strife and external pressures, faced its final catastrophe. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian forces surrounded Jerusalem for what would be the last time. The siege lasted months. Food ran out, disease spread through the overcrowded city, and when the walls finally fell, what followed was systematic destruction. The temple, Solomon's temple, the center of Jewish religious life, the physical manifestation of the covenant between God and his people, burned. Not just damaged, not just looted, burned to its foundations. The gold, the bronze pillars, the sacred vessels, everything of value was carted off to Babylon. Everything else was destroyed. For a people whose entire religious and cultural life centered on this place, this wasn't just a military defeat. This was the shattering of their world. But destruction was only the beginning. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't interested in mere conquest. He wanted to prevent future rebellion, and his solution was deportation. The kingdom's educated class, its craftsmen, its priests, its administrators, anyone with the skills or knowledge that might threaten Babylonian control, were rounded up and marched east. 500 miles on foot, weeks of walking through desert and along the Euphrates, carrying what little they'd been allowed to take, watching their homeland disappear behind them. Historians estimate somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people were deported in the various waves. That might not sound like much by modern standards, but for a small kingdom like Judah, it was devastating. These weren't random deportees. They were the leadership, the intellectual and spiritual core of the nation. Nebuchadnezzar knew exactly what he was doing. Those of you who remember displaced persons camps after World War II might have some sense of what this meant. Not just losing your home, but losing your place in the world. Being transported to somewhere utterly foreign, where the language, customs, laws, even the gods were different. Where everything familiar had been left behind. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Because what Nebuchadnezzar intended as cultural destruction became, somehow, cultural preservation. The exiles in Babylon didn't disappear into the local population. They didn't, over a generation or two, just become Babylonians who happened to have Judean ancestry. Instead, they did something remarkable. They adapted enough to survive while maintaining enough separation to remain distinct. Think about what that required. They needed to learn Babylonian language and customs well enough to function, to earn livelihoods, to raise families. But they also needed to pass down their own language, their own practices, their own stories, in an environment where every external pressure pushed towards assimilation. And they did it without a temple, without priests performing daily sacrifices, without the physical and ritual structure that had defined their religion for centuries. This is where the synagogue was born, though they didn't call it that yet. Small groups gathering in homes or simple buildings, reading and discussing the texts they brought with them, maintaining the Sabbath and other practices, teaching children Hebrew alongside Aramaic. Prayer and study began replacing sacrifice and ritual. The religion was transforming, adapting to exile, becoming something that could survive without a homeland. Babylonian records from this period show Jewish names in commercial documents. They were buying property, conducting trade, even serving in administrative positions. Some became quite successful. This wasn't a concentration camp or a refugee camp. This was forced relocation with, eventually, a degree of integration and economic opportunity, which created its own challenges. Because the more successful you became in Babylon, the more comfortable your life became, the harder it was to maintain that connection to a destroyed homeland hundreds of miles away. Your children spoke Aramaic better than Hebrew. They had Babylonian friends, maybe even married into Babylonian families. The old stories about Jerusalem and the temple started to feel like myth rather than memory. And yet somehow, enough families resisted that comfortable slide into assimilation to keep the identity alive. Scholars still debate why. Part of it was certainly religious conviction. Part of it was the strength of community and family tradition. Part of it might have been simple stubbornness, the very human refusal to let conquerors erase you. Whatever the reasons, by the time Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE and offered the exiles the chance to return home, there were still Jews in Babylon who remembered who they were and where they came from. Not all of them went back, though. That's crucial to understand. Many families had been in Babylon for 2 or 3 generations by then. They had businesses, homes. Jerusalem was a ruin. Returning meant abandoning everything they'd built to start over in a devastated land. So the community split. Some returned to rebuild the temple and the city. Others stayed in Babylon, maintaining their Jewish identity while remaining in exile. This established a pattern that would repeat for the next 2,500 years. Jewish communities scattered across different lands, some maintaining connection with Jerusalem, or later with other centers, some living in relative isolation, but all somehow maintaining that core identity. The Babylonian Jewish community, in fact, would remain significant for centuries, producing the Babylonian Talmud, one of Judaism's most important texts, long after the Second Temple period ended. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because the return from Babylon, the rebuilding of the temple under Persian rule, the restoration of Jewish life in Judea, all of that would prove temporary. The great scattering, the real diaspora that would define Jewish history for the next 2 millennia, was still to come. And when it came, it would make the Babylonian exile look like a brief interruption. The Second Temple stood for nearly 6 centuries, built after the return from Babylon, expanded magnificently by Herod the Great. It became not just a religious center, but a symbol of Jewish continuity and identity. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Jerusalem was a major city, a pilgrimage destination, a place where Jewish life and scholarship flourished despite being under Roman control. Roman occupation wasn't like Babylonian conquest. The Romans generally allowed subject peoples to maintain their own religions and customs, as long as they paid taxes and didn't rebel. But Judea proved troublesome. Jewish monotheism didn't mesh well with Roman emperor worship. Jewish law and Roman law conflicted on numerous points. And the memory of independence, only a few generations past under the Hasmonean dynasty, made Roman rule particularly galling. Tensions built through the 1st century. There were protests, riots, occasional uprisings quickly crushed. Messianic movements emerged and were destroyed. The Romans appointed and removed high priests, meddled in temple administration, stationed troops too close to sacred spaces. Every small indignity added up. And in 66 CE, it exploded. The First Jewish-Roman War started as a protest against Roman mismanagement and escalated into full-scale rebellion. Jewish forces actually achieved some early successes, driving Roman troops out of Jerusalem, defeating Roman forces in several battles. For a brief moment, it must have seemed possible that Jewish independence might be restored. It wasn't possible. Rome didn't lose wars against provincial rebels. The empire brought overwhelming force to bear. 4 legions, auxiliary troops, the best military minds of the generation. And in 70 CE, after a brutal siege, Jerusalem fell. The temple was destroyed. Not damaged this time, completely destroyed. The Romans weren't Babylonians looking to cart off treasure. They were sending a message. The building was pulled down stone by stone. The sacred vessels were taken to Rome as trophies. The priesthood was scattered or killed. The center of Jewish religious life, the place where sacrifices had been offered for centuries, simply ceased to exist. And the casualties were staggering. The historian Josephus, who witnessed these events, claimed over 1 million Jews died during the war. That's almost certainly an exaggeration. Ancient historians loved big numbers, but even if the real figure was 1/10 of that, it represents catastrophic losses. Hundreds of thousands killed in battle, in sieges, in the aftermath. Thousands more sold into slavery and shipped across the empire. Those of you who remember reading about the Holocaust, or who knew survivors, understand what total war against a population means. The Roman campaign wasn't genocide in the modern sense. They weren't trying to eliminate Jews as a people, but it was devastatingly thorough. And unlike the Babylonian exile where the elite were deported but others remained in the land, this time the devastation was more complete. A second rebellion, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, flared between 132 and 135 CE. It failed even more catastrophically. The Emperor Hadrian was less patient than his predecessors. He banned Jewish religious practices, built a Roman city on Jerusalem's ruins, renamed the entire province Syria Palestina deliberately to erase Jewish connection to the land. And Jews were barred from Jerusalem except for 1 day a year. This was the real diaspora, not a temporary exile like Babylon, not something that might be reversed in a generation or 2, but permanent dispersal. Jewish communities already existed across the Roman Empire before 70 CE. in Alexandria, Rome, North Africa, Asia Minor. But now tens of thousands more, scattered, forcibly or by choice, fleeing devastation and persecution. The homeland was gone. The temple was gone. The priesthood was gone. Everything that had structured Jewish religious life for over 1,000 years had been destroyed. And yet somehow they survived. Not just survived, they adapted, evolved, maintained identity across distances and circumstances that should have obliterated any sense of cohesion. The question that drives this entire story is simple. How? How did they do it? The decades after 70 CE saw something unprecedented in ancient history. Most conquered peoples either died out or assimilated within a few generations. The Carthaginians, utterly destroyed by Rome, simply disappeared as a distinct culture. The Gauls became Romans who happened to live in Gaul. The Egyptians, Greeks, Syrians, all gradually absorbed into the Roman system, their native identities fading into local color rather than sustained national or religious consciousness. Jews scattered across the same empire, subject to the same incentives to assimilate. And yet they didn't. Instead, communities from Spain to Mesopotamia, from North Africa to the Rhine, maintained Jewish identity across centuries. How they managed this remains one of history's more fascinating puzzles. Early diaspora communities were small, scattered, often isolated from one another. A Jewish family in 2nd century Carthage might go years without contact with Jewish communities elsewhere. Communication was slow, expensive, dependent on merchants and travelers who happened to be going the right direction. There was no central authority, no unified leadership structure. The temple was gone, the Sanhedrin had been dissolved. Each community was essentially on its own, which created a problem. Without centralized authority, without priests performing daily rituals, without a physical center to orient toward, what held these communities together? What made someone in Roman Spain feel connected to someone in Persian Mesopotamia? What kept the religion from splintering into dozens of incompatible local variations? The answer, it turns out, was text and law. Not just any text, Torah, the foundational scriptures, and increasingly, the oral traditions and interpretations that would eventually become the Talmud. And not just any law, but halakha, Jewish religious law, which covered everything from Sabbath observance to dietary restrictions to marriage customs. These became the portable homeland, the center that could exist anywhere. Think about what this meant practically. A family in Alexandria could observe Sabbath the same way a family in Rome did, because both had access to the same texts and traditions. A question about proper practice could be debated by scholars in different cities, their arguments traveling by letter, building a body of interpretation that transcended geography. The religion became more textual, more focused on study and interpretation, precisely because it had to function without a temple or homeland. This wasn't without controversy or variation. Different communities developed different customs. Babylonian Jews had practices that differed from Palestinian Jews. Arguments about interpretation and practice were constant. But the remarkable thing is that they argued within a shared framework. They recognized each other as part of the same tradition, even when they disagreed about details. The synagogue emerged as the central institution, not a replacement for the temple, which would have been theologically impossible, but something new. A place for prayer, study, community gathering, education. Unlike temples in other religions, which were usually the domain of priests performing rituals, synagogues were community spaces. Any 10 adult men could form a minyan and conduct services. Leadership came from knowledge and scholarship, not hereditary priesthood. This democratization of religious practice was revolutionary. In most ancient religions, ordinary people were spectators to rituals performed by professionals. In diaspora Judaism, every man was expected to be literate enough to read Torah, to participate in services, to engage with the tradition intellectually. Education became crucial. Communities pooled resources to hire teachers, maintain schools, ensure that the next generation could read Hebrew even if they spoke Greek or Latin or Aramaic in daily life. Those of you who grew up when every neighborhood had its own schools, when community institutions were strong and local, might have some sense of how this worked. The synagogue wasn't just for Saturday services. It was the community center, the school, the place where disputes were mediated, where travelers found hospitality, where charity was organized, where marriages were arranged. It was, in a very real sense, a portable piece of homeland. But maintaining this separateness came with costs. Roman society was cosmopolitan, diverse, generally tolerant of different religions. But it expected participation in civic life, which often involved rituals honoring the emperor or various gods. Jews who refused were seen as antisocial, possibly seditious. Dietary laws meant Jews couldn't easily share meals with non-Jews. Sabbath observance meant they couldn't work one day in 7, putting them at economic disadvantage. Circumcision struck Greeks and Romans as barbaric mutilation. Resentment built. Not everywhere, not constantly, but it simmered. Jews were successful enough to provoke envy. Their literacy rates were higher, their community support networks stronger, their business networks more extensive, but they remained apart enough to seem foreign, clannish, suspicious. Rumors circulated, accusations that Jews were misanthropic, that they held secret rituals, that their refusal to honor Roman gods brought divine displeasure on cities. Occasional violence erupted. Riots in Alexandria killed thousands of Jews in the 1st century. Expulsions from Rome occurred periodically. Restrictions on where Jews could live, what professions they could practice, what rights they held. These came and went depending on the emperor, the local governor, the mood of the populace. And yet the communities persisted. Families made it work. They found ways to earn livings within the constraints. They educated their children in both Jewish tradition and the skills needed to navigate Roman society. They maintained networks of trade and communication with other Jewish communities. They survived the bad times and prospered during the good times. Never quite assimilating, but never quite separating either. This pattern, integration without assimilation, participation in broader society while maintaining distinct identity, success despite discrimination, survival through community cohesion, would characterize diaspora Jewish life for the next 2,000 years. The specific circumstances would change. The host societies would change from Roman to Christian to Muslim to secular. But the basic dynamic would remain remarkably consistent. The synagogues that emerged in the diaspora centuries were far more than houses of worship. They became, in effect, the portable state, the movable homeland, the physical manifestation of Jewish communal life wherever it found itself. Consider what had been lost. The temple had been the central institution, not just religiously, but economically, politically, socially. It employed thousands. It held the community's treasury. Its priesthood provided leadership. Pilgrims traveled from across the ancient world 3 times a year, bringing offerings, conducting business, celebrating festivals together. The temple gave Jews a physical center, a place where heaven and earth supposedly met, where the divine presence dwelt among the people. All of that was gone. So diaspora communities rebuilt, in miniature and in modified form, what they needed to survive as distinct communities. And the institution they created, the synagogue, turned out to be remarkably adaptable. Unlike the temple, with its hereditary priesthood and elaborate ritual requirements, synagogues operated democratically. Leadership came from knowledge, not birth. Any knowledgeable member could lead prayers or read Torah. Decisions affecting the community were made collectively, or by a council of elders, or by the most learned scholars. It varied by location and era, but the principle remained: authority came from below, from the community itself. This had profound implications. It meant diaspora Judaism became more egalitarian, more focused on individual responsibility and collective deliberation. It meant that communities in different places facing different circumstances could adapt their practices while maintaining core principles. It meant the religion could survive without a central authority structure that might be destroyed or corrupted. The synagogue building itself was less important than what happened inside it. Some were grand structures. Archaeology has uncovered remarkably elaborate synagogues in cities like Sardis and Dura Europos, buildings that rivaled pagan temples in size and decoration. Others were simple rooms, adapted houses, temporary spaces. What mattered was the community that gathered there. Prayer services followed a structure that would remain remarkably consistent across centuries and continents. The Shema, declaring God's unity. The Amidah, 18 blessings recited standing. Readings from Torah and the prophets on Sabbath and festivals. Psalms. Hymns. This liturgy became standardized enough that a Jew from Spain could attend services in Baghdad and recognize the prayers even if the melodies or pronunciation differed. But beyond prayer, synagogues served as schools. This might have been their most important function. Jewish law required that fathers teach their sons to read Torah. In practice, communities hired teachers, organized schools, ensured universal male literacy at a time when most of the world was illiterate. Boys started young, learning Hebrew alphabet, progressing to reading Torah, eventually studying more complex texts and commentaries. This wasn't just religious education. Literacy in Hebrew meant these children could also read Aramaic, could often pick up Greek or Latin more easily. They learned to analyze texts, engage in logical argument, think abstractly. The skills developed studying Talmud, careful reading, attention to detail, logical reasoning, ability to see multiple perspectives, transferred to other domains. Jewish success in commerce, medicine, philosophy, law, throughout the medieval period, had roots in this educational system. Women's education was less systematic, usually occurring at home. But many Jewish women in the diaspora could read Hebrew prayers even if they couldn't engage with complex Talmudic arguments. Some sources mention women who were learned in Torah, though this remained exceptional rather than expected. The synagogue also functioned as the community's social welfare system. Every Jewish community collected charity, tzedakah, literally righteousness, which wasn't optional charity, but an obligation. Money went to supporting the poor, ransoming captives, providing dowries for poor brides, caring for widows and orphans, helping travelers. The synagogue administered these funds and distributed them fairly. If you remember small-town America before the welfare state, when communities took care of their own through churches and civic organizations, you'll recognize the pattern. But Jewish charity was more systematized, more obligatory. Wealthy community members were expected to contribute proportional to their wealth. Poor members had a right, not a privilege, but a right, to community support. This welfare system helped prevent Jews from becoming destitute and thus dependent on the broader society, which might pressure them to convert or assimilate. It also strengthened community bonds. Everyone knew that if misfortune struck, illness, business failure, attack by bandits, the community would help. This security encouraged taking business risks, supporting each other's ventures, maintaining the commercial networks that characterized Jewish diaspora life. The synagogue administered justice too, or at least tried to. Jewish communities generally had permission from ruling authorities to handle internal disputes according to Jewish law. Rabbis or community elders would hear cases, render judgments based on halakha, enforce their decisions through community pressure and the threat of excommunication. This wasn't always perfect. People could and did appeal to secular courts when they thought they'd get a better result, but it meant communities could maintain internal order without constantly involving outside authorities. All of this, worship, education, charity, justice, made the synagogue the center of communal life. It was where you went not just on Sabbath, but throughout the week, where you saw your neighbors, heard news from other communities, conducted business, sought help, resolved problems. It was, in a very real sense, the substitute for a homeland. The building might be in Rome or Alexandria or Cordoba, but inside, you were among your people, following your laws, maintaining your traditions. This institutional innovation, the synagogue as multi-purpose community center, proved remarkably durable. It would survive the collapse of the Roman Empire, the rise of Christianity and Islam, medieval persecutions, early modern upheavals, modern attempts at assimilation. 2,000 years later, synagogues still function essentially the same way, as houses of prayer, certainly, but also as schools, community centers, charitable organizations, places where Jewish life happens. Not bad for an institution that was improvised, out of necessity by refugees who'd lost everything. Without the temple, who had authority, without priests, who interpreted law, without the Sanhedrin, who decided disputes. These weren't abstract questions. They were practical problems that diaspora communities faced daily. The answer that emerged was Rabbinic Judaism. The idea that authority came from learning, from mastery of Torah and the traditions of interpretation, from the ability to analyze texts and reach sound legal conclusions. A rabbi, literally my teacher, wasn't a priest or a mystic or a prophet. He was a scholar who'd spent years studying, learning from other scholars, and demonstrating the ability to understand and apply Jewish law. This was revolutionary. Most ancient religions vested authority in hereditary priesthoods, royal dynasties, or prophetic charisma. Judaism in the diaspora vested authority in intellectual achievement. If you studied hard enough, learned deeply enough, reasoned carefully enough, you could become a recognized authority regardless of your family background or economic status. Theory and practice didn't always align perfectly, but the principle remained: knowledge trumped birth. The legal system that emerged was halakha, literally the way to walk, the path of religious observance and proper conduct. It covered everything: how to observe Sabbath, dietary restrictions, marriage and divorce, business ethics, charity obligations, ritual purity, criminal law, civil law, agricultural practices. It was comprehensive, detailed, and designed to maintain Jewish identity and community cohesion wherever Jews found themselves. Halakha wasn't static. It developed through argument and interpretation. Rabbis in Babylonia would debate the meaning of a passage in Torah, reach a conclusion, write it down, send it to colleagues in other cities for comment. Those colleagues would argue back, cite precedents, offer alternative interpretations. Over time, these accumulated discussions formed the Talmud, actually two Talmuds, one from Palestine, one from Babylon, each recording centuries of legal argument and interpretation. This argumentative, text-based approach had several advantages for a diaspora people. First, it was portable. You didn't need a temple or sacred geography. You needed texts and trained minds. Second, it was adaptable. When circumstances changed, new questions arose that earlier generations hadn't faced. Rabbis could interpret principles to address new situations. Third, it maintained unity. Communities in different places might reach different conclusions on details, but they were arguing within the same framework, referencing the same sources, using the same methods. Legal authority became networked rather than centralized. Particularly learned rabbis gained reputations that extended far beyond their immediate communities. Their legal opinions, responsa, were sought by communities hundreds or thousands of miles away. Over time, certain scholars' views carried more weight. Their interpretations became precedents, but no single authority could dictate to all communities. Authority had to be earned continuously through demonstrated wisdom and learning. Those of you who remember pre-internet America, when information moved slowly and authority was local but still connected to broader networks, might have some sense of how this worked. A local rabbi would handle most questions, but difficult cases might be referred to a recognized scholar in a major center. That scholar's opinion carried weight but wasn't absolutely binding. Communities could choose which authorities to follow, which traditions to emphasize. This flexibility proved crucial because diaspora communities faced wildly different circumstances. Jews living under Christian rule in medieval Europe dealt with different challenges than Jews under Muslim rule in North Africa or Persia. Business practices that worked in an agricultural community made no sense in a commercial city. Halakha had to be applicable everywhere, while respecting local realities. The development of Halakha also created a culture of learning and argumentation that became central to Jewish identity. A good Jew wasn't just someone who observed the commandments. He was someone who understood why, who could cite sources, who could engage in informed debate. Study became a form of worship, perhaps the highest form. The ideal wasn't the warrior or the mystic or even the priest, but the scholar who devoted his life to understanding Torah and its application. This ideal was gendered. Women were generally excluded from Talmudic study, their religious obligations structured differently. But for men, regardless of economic status, scholarship was the ultimate achievement. A wealthy merchant who was ignorant of Torah ranked below a poor scholar who'd mastered it. This created social mobility through education and reinforced the community's commitment to universal male literacy. It also created a distinct Jewish intellectual culture. The Talmudic method of argument, examining a text from multiple angles, considering objections, weighing precedents, reaching conclusions through logic rather than intuition or authority, shaped how educated Jews approached problems. This analytical rigor, this comfort with complexity and ambiguity, this habit of examining questions from multiple perspectives, transferred to other fields when Jews eventually entered secular intellectual life in large numbers. But Halakha wasn't just about intellectual exercise. It structured daily life in ways that maintained Jewish distinction. Keeping kosher meant you thought carefully about what you ate, where you ate, whom you ate with. Sabbath observance meant one day in 7 was fundamentally different, withdrawn from commerce and labor, devoted to rest and study and family. Prayer times throughout the day created a rhythm distinct from the surrounding society. These practices were not just personally meaningful, they were community boundaries, ways of maintaining cohesion and preventing assimilation. Critics, both ancient and modern, have sometimes portrayed this legalism as burdensome, oppressive, life-draining. And certainly some people found it that way. But for many, Halakha provided structure, meaning, connection. It made every meal, every transaction, every day part of something sacred. It connected you to communities across space and generations across time, all following the same basic path. If you're sitting here in 2026 thinking about the loss of community, about how fragmented modern life has become, about how little connects us to our neighbors or our history, well, consider what diaspora Jews created. A system of law and practice that maintained connection across impossible distances for thousands of years. An identity so strong that assimilation remained incomplete even when every external pressure pushed toward it. We could do worse than to study how they managed it. Here's something remarkable. For most of Jewish diaspora history, Jews were among the world's most literate populations. In medieval Europe, when perhaps 5% of Christians could read, male Jewish literacy approached universal. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, necessary, fundamental to survival. Language became the homeland that couldn't be conquered or destroyed. When your physical territory is taken, when you're scattered across continents, when you lack political power, what you can carry in your mind and pass to your children becomes everything. And what Jews carried was text. Hebrew, the language of Torah and prayer, was taught to boys from age 4 or 5. Even those who grew up speaking Yiddish or Ladino or Judeo-Arabic, even those who never set foot in Palestine, learned Hebrew. Not just the alphabet, but the ability to read and understand the prayers, to follow Torah readings, to engage with sacred texts. This created a direct connection to the tradition that didn't depend on priests or institutions. Every literate Jew had access to the foundational documents of his religion. But Jews didn't just preserve Hebrew. They created literature, biblical commentaries, legal codes, philosophical works, poetry, ethical treatises, mystical texts, historical chronicles, responsa collections, and they did this in multiple languages: Hebrew for sacred works, Aramaic for legal discussion, Greek for philosophy, Arabic for science and medicine, Yiddish for folk tales, Ladino for popular literature. This multilingualism was another survival strategy. Jews needed to function in the societies where they lived, so they learned local languages. But they maintained Hebrew for religious purposes, creating a linguistic separation between sacred and secular that reinforced community boundaries. A Jew in 10th century Baghdad spoke Arabic in the marketplace, but Hebrew in the synagogue. This bilingualism or multilingualism became so natural that it characterized Jewish communities wherever they found themselves. The creation of Jewish languages, Yiddish in Germanic lands, Ladino in Spain, Judeo-Arabic in the Muslim world, demonstrates the unique position Jews occupied. These were Jewish adaptations of local languages, written in Hebrew characters, incorporating Hebrew and Aramaic religious terms, structured by Jewish grammar and syntax patterns. A Jewish language meant you could communicate with other Jews from distant communities while remaining somewhat opaque to your non-Jewish neighbors. It was private, portable, and reinforced identity. The physical production of texts was itself an act of preservation. Before printing, every book had to be copied by hand. Jewish communities invested enormous resources in this work. Scribes who specialized in Torah scrolls trained for years, learning the precise rules governing every letter. A Torah scroll had to be perfect. One error required correction or genizah, ritual storage until proper disposal. But beyond Torah scrolls, Jews copied and recopied texts of all kinds: the Talmud, commentaries, prayer books, philosophical works, poetry collections. Some scribes made their living at it. Others copied texts for their communities as a pious act. Some families maintained their own small libraries, collections built up over generations. Wealthy patrons commissioned beautiful illuminated manuscripts as charity and status display. This continuous copying process meant texts survived. When one community was destroyed, copies existed elsewhere. When a library burned, the works could be reproduced from memory or from copies in distant cities. The redundancy built into the system through thousands of individual copying acts protected Jewish literature from the losses that destroyed so much ancient and medieval writing. The Cairo Genizah, discovered in the late 19th century, offers a window into this world of texts. When sacred Jewish documents became too worn to use, they couldn't simply be destroyed. That would be disrespectful to God's name written within them. So communities stored them in special rooms until they could be properly buried. The Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo maintained such a genizah for centuries, and its dry climate accidentally preserved hundreds of thousands of documents. What scholars found was extraordinary. Not just religious texts, but business letters, marriage contracts, personal correspondence, shopping lists, children's schoolwork, an entire medieval Jewish community's paper trail, providing insight into daily life that the grand historical narratives miss. A letter from a merchant in India to his wife in Egypt, a philosophical treatise, a child's grammar exercise, love poetry, legal disputes, medical prescriptions. The Genizah demonstrates how thoroughly text permeated Jewish diaspora life. These weren't just people who had some books. These were people who documented everything, who wrote constantly, who lived immersed in words to a degree unusual in the medieval world. Those of you who remember when letter writing was still common, before phones became ubiquitous and email replaced handwriting, might appreciate what this meant. Words connected people across distances. Letters maintained relationships, conducted business, shared news. For Jews, this was multiplied. Letters carried not just personal information, but Torah interpretations, legal opinions, community decisions. The literary output was vast. Biblical commentary alone filled libraries. Rashi's 11th century commentary on Torah and Talmud became so standard that it's printed alongside the original texts to this day. Maimonides in 12th century Egypt wrote the Mishneh Torah, a systematic code of all Jewish law, and the Guide for the Perplexed, a philosophical work reconciling reason and revelation. Judah Halevi wrote poetry in Hebrew that's still considered among the finest ever produced in that language. This wasn't literature for its own sake. It was functional, meant to guide life and preserve tradition. But it was often beautiful, profound, intellectually sophisticated. Jews in the diaspora created high culture while politically powerless and often economically marginal. They did it through literacy, scholarship, the commitment to preserving and expanding their tradition in every generation. The printing press, when it arrived in the 15th century, revolutionized Jewish learning just as it did Christian Europe. But Jews had a head start. They already had a culture of universal male literacy, established networks for distributing texts, communities eager to purchase books. The first Hebrew book was printed in 1475, just 20 years after Gutenberg's Bible. By 1500, Hebrew books were being printed in dozens of cities across Europe and the Mediterranean. Printing democratized learning even further. A student who couldn't afford manuscript copies could buy printed editions. Communities too small to support a scribe could maintain libraries of printed works. Standardization meant that Jews in Poland and Jews in Morocco could study from identical texts, using the same commentaries, following the same arguments. This reinforced unity even as communities were physically separated by thousands of miles. Language and literature served as the portable homeland. Wherever Jews found themselves, whatever language they spoke daily, they returned to Hebrew for prayer and study. They maintained connection through text and interpretation, through the shared project of preserving and expanding tradition. This made them both integrated in their host societies and, apart from them, functioning in local languages and economies while maintaining an internal world conducted in Hebrew and governed by halakha. It was, in retrospect, an extraordinary achievement. A people without political power or territory, maintaining distinct identity across centuries through the power of words and the commitment to teaching every child to read them. The story of Jewish diaspora isn't simply one of successful adaptation and cultural preservation. That would be dishonest. The reality included repeated cycles of persecution, expulsion, violence, and forced displacement that complicated and sometimes nearly destroyed communities that had flourished for generations. Understanding why requires understanding the precarious position Jews occupied in Christian and Muslim societies. They were useful, literate, skilled in commerce and finance, connected to international trade networks. But they were also different, refusing to convert, maintaining separate practices, sometimes prospering while their neighbors struggled. This combination of utility and otherness made them simultaneously valued and resented. The pattern repeated across centuries and continents with depressing regularity. A community would establish itself, contribute to the economy, perhaps even thrive for several generations. Then some crisis would occur. Economic downturn, military defeat, political instability, religious fervor. And the Jewish community would become the scapegoat. Accusations would fly. Violence would erupt. Authorities would either participate in or fail to prevent attacks. And Jews would be killed, forcibly converted, expelled, or some combination of all three. The Rhineland massacres of 1096 during the First Crusade killed thousands of Jews in German cities. Crusaders, fired up to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, decided Jews were equally legitimate targets. Communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed in days. Some Jews chose martyrdom rather than forced conversion. Others were killed regardless of their choices. Local bishops sometimes tried to protect Jews, sometimes participated in the violence, sometimes stood aside and let it happen. England expelled all Jews in 1290. France expelled Jews repeatedly, 1282, 1306, 1394, each time confiscating property each time leaving communities devastated. German territories saw waves of violence during the Black Death, as Jews were accused of poisoning wells to cause the plague. Never mind that Jews were dying from plague too. Fear and prejudice don't require logical consistency. The Spanish Inquisition represents perhaps the most systematically brutal persecution. Spain had been home to one of history's most successful Jewish communities. Under Muslim rule in Al-Andalus, Jews had thrived as scholars, physicians, merchants, poets. The golden age of Spanish Jewry produced some of Judaism's greatest thinkers and most beautiful literature. Even after Christian reconquest, Spanish Jews, Sephardim, remained relatively secure for centuries. That changed in 1392. The same year Columbus sailed west, Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Edict of Expulsion. Jews had 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave Spain. All of them. Estimates suggest between 100 and 200,000 people were affected. Scholars still debate the exact number, but it was catastrophic. Those who converted, conversos or new Christians, the Inquisition was established specifically to root out false converts who secretly maintained Jewish practices. Thousands were arrested, tried, tortured. The paranoia was extraordinary. Having a clean house on Friday, preparing for Sabbath, could be evidence of secret Judaism. Not eating pork, changing clothes on Saturday. The Inquisition records are filled with testimony about these tiny observations that could mean death. Those who left faced their own horrors. Some went to Portugal, only to be expelled from there 5 years later. Others went to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire, to Italy, to the Netherlands. The voyage itself killed many. Ships were overcrowded, supplies inadequate, captains sometimes unscrupulous. Stories circulated of refugees being robbed, enslaved, or killed. Families were separated. Communities that had existed for half a millennium dissolved in months. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Bayezid II welcomed Sephardic refugees. "You venture to call Ferdinand a wise ruler," Bayezid reportedly said of the Spanish king. "He who has impoverished his own country and enriched mine." The Ottomans recognized that Spain's loss could be their gain. Spanish Jews brought literacy, medical knowledge, commercial connections, and technological expertise. Communities established themselves in Constantinople, Salonika, Izmir, Jerusalem. They maintained Spanish language and customs for centuries, creating the Ladino-speaking Sephardic culture that flourished until the 20th century. But the pattern wasn't limited to Christian Europe. Jewish communities under Muslim rule generally fared better. Islamic law accorded Jews dhimmi status, protected minorities with certain rights, though certainly not equal to Muslims. But that protection was never absolute and varied dramatically by place and period. The Almohad invasion of North Africa and Spain in the 12th century forced conversions or exile. Occasional violence erupted in Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus. The overall treatment was usually better than in Christian lands, but better is relative. Jews remained second-class subjects, subject to discriminatory taxes, occasional restrictions, periodic violence. Eastern Europe developed its own patterns of persecution. The Chmielnitsky uprising in 1648 through 1654 killed tens of thousands of Jews in Poland and Ukraine. Cossack and peasant forces massacred entire communities. The violence was brutal, systematic, remembered in Jewish collective memory with a shudder. Those who survived sometimes fled west into the German territories. Others stayed, rebuilt, continued. Because what choice did they have? The pattern continued into the modern era. Russian pogroms in the 1880s and early 1900s killed thousands and prompted massive emigration to America and Western Europe. These weren't medieval superstition. These were modern, organized campaigns of violence, often with government complicity or instigation. Jews were blamed for economic problems, for political radicalism, for any convenient scapegoating need. Those of you who remember the late 1940s and early 50s, who saw the newsreels from liberated concentration camps, understand where this pattern ultimately led. The Holocaust wasn't an aberration from European Jewish history. It was the horrifying culmination of centuries of persecution, made possible by modern technology and totalitarian organization. 2,000 years of diaspora experience with violence and expulsion didn't prepare Jews for the industrial-scale murder that Nazi Germany implemented. We'll return to the 20th century later. But understanding the cycle of persecution, temporary stability, prosperity, renewed persecution helps explain several crucial aspects of diaspora experience. First, it explains the constant insecurity, the knowledge that however settled you felt, however successful your community became, it could all be destroyed rapidly. Second, it explains the emphasis on portable wealth, education, skills, commercial networks, rather than land or fixed assets that could be confiscated. Third, it explains the strength of community bonds forged in shared suffering and mutual dependence. It also explains why some Jews eventually concluded that diaspora itself was the problem, that no matter how well they adapted, how much they contributed, how successfully they integrated, they would never be fully safe as minorities in other people's lands. This realization that external factors beyond Jewish control made persecution likely to recur would eventually fuel political Zionism's argument that only Jewish sovereignty in a Jewish homeland could provide real security. But we're getting ahead of the story. Because alongside persecution and expulsion, diaspora life also involved remarkable cultural exchanges, periods of genuine flourishing, and complex negotiations between maintaining identity and engaging with broader intellectual and social currents. Not all of diaspora history was persecution and survival. Much of it involved something more complex and interesting: cultural exchange, mutual influence, the emergence of hybrid forms that were distinctly Jewish but shaped by interaction with surrounding cultures. Jewish communities lived for centuries in close proximity to Christians, Muslims, and others. They couldn't help but influence and be influenced by their neighbors. The question was never whether exchange would occur, but how much, in what ways, and whether it threatened Jewish identity or enriched it. Medieval Spain under Muslim rule provides perhaps the best example of successful cultural synthesis. The Jewish community there became deeply engaged with Islamic philosophy, science, and poetry. Jewish philosophers like Saadia Gaon, Judah Halevi, and especially Moses Maimonides wrote in Arabic, engaged with Islamic thought, incorporated Aristotelian philosophy into Jewish theology. They remained thoroughly Jewish. Maimonides' legal code and guide for the perplexed were meant to strengthen Jewish faith and practice. But their intellectual framework was shaped by the broader philosophical discourse occurring in the Islamic world. Jewish poets adopted Arabic verse forms, writing Hebrew poetry that used meter and rhyme patterns borrowed from Arabic literature. The poetry remained Jewish in content, religious themes, biblical references, Hebrew language. But the aesthetics were hybrid. This wasn't corruption of tradition, it was innovation within tradition, using new forms to express ancient themes. Science and medicine saw similar exchange. Jewish physicians trained in Arabic medical texts, incorporated Greek and Islamic medical knowledge, served Muslim and Christian rulers as personal doctors. Jewish translators rendered Arabic scientific and philosophical works into Latin, playing a crucial role in transmitting Islamic learning to Christian Europe. The intellectual achievements of the Islamic Golden Age reached Europe partly through Jewish intermediaries who could navigate multiple cultures and languages. This cultural openness had limits, of course. Jews didn't adopt Islamic or Christian theology. They didn't abandon dietary laws or Sabbath observance. They maintained communal boundaries even while engaging intellectually with outsiders. The synthesis was selective, careful, always tested against the standards of halakha and tradition. Renaissance Italy saw similar dynamics. Jews engaged with Renaissance humanism, studied classical texts, wrote in Italian as well as Hebrew. Some Jewish scholars participated in Christian humanist circles. The boundaries became more permeable even as communities maintained distinct identity. Jewish printers published not just Hebrew texts but also classical works, contributing to the broader Renaissance project while maintaining their own tradition. But cultural exchange created tensions. How much could you adopt from surrounding culture without losing Jewish identity? Where was the line between adaptation and assimilation? These questions produced fierce debates within Jewish communities and still do today. The Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment of the 18th and 19th centuries, brought these tensions to a head. Maskilim, Enlightenment advocates, argued that Jews needed to engage with modern secular learning, adopt local languages and customs, participate fully in European society. They criticized traditional Jewish education as too narrow, Jewish separateness as backward, rabbinic authority as obsolete. They wanted Jews to be Germans or Frenchmen or Russians who happened to practice Judaism, not a separate nation maintaining distinct culture within European societies. This wasn't simple assimilation. Most masculine remained committed to Judaism, wanted to reform and modernize it rather than abandon it, but they believed diaspora required integration, that the old ways of maintaining separation weren't viable or desirable in the modern world. They promoted secular education, vocational training, adoption of local dress and language, participation in broader cultural and intellectual life. Traditional rabbis and communities resisted. They saw Haskalah as a threat to everything they'd preserved through centuries of exile. Secular education would lead to religious ignorance. Adoption of local customs would erase Jewish distinctiveness. Integration would end in assimilation and ultimately in the disappearance of Judaism. Better to maintain separation, traditional education, rabbinic authority, even if it meant economic hardship and continued marginalization. The debate wasn't purely intellectual. It split communities, divided families, created new forms of Judaism. Reform Judaism emerged, arguing for modernization of ritual and theology. Conservative Judaism developed as a middle path. Modern Orthodoxy tried to maintain traditional observance while engaging with secular world. Ultra-Orthodox communities doubled down on separatism and rejected modernity entirely. Those of you who grew up when immigration and assimilation were major social forces in America, when ethnic communities struggled with how much of the old ways to keep and how much to adopt American culture, might recognize this dynamic. The specifics were Jewish, but the dilemma was universal. How do you maintain distinct identity while participating in broader society? How do you give your children both tradition and opportunity? When does adaptation become abandonment? For many Jews, particularly in Western Europe and America, the answer was integration. They became Germans, Frenchmen, Englishmen, Americans of the Jewish faith. They spoke the local language, dressed like their neighbors, entered professions previously closed to Jews, participated in civic life. They saw Judaism as a religion, not a nationality, something personal and private, compatible with full participation in modern nation-states. This worked for several generations. Jews achieved remarkable success in business, arts, sciences, politics. They contributed to their societies out of proportion to their numbers. In Germany particularly, Jews became thoroughly integrated into intellectual and cultural life. They were patriots, served in World War I, believed themselves fully German. Then came the Holocaust, shattering the illusion that integration guaranteed safety. Nazi Germany stripped citizenship from Jews, defined them as racial enemies regardless of religious practice or cultural integration, systematically murdered 6 million. It didn't matter if your family had lived in Germany for centuries, if you'd fought for Germany in the Great War, if you'd converted to Christianity. Jewish ancestry, no matter how distant, meant death. The Holocaust posed fundamental questions about diaspora itself. If even the most successful integration in the most culturally advanced nation could end in industrial-scale murder, was there any safety for Jews as minorities? Did diaspora inevitably mean vulnerability? These questions would drive survivors and their descendants toward different conclusions, some toward deeper assimilation and secular universalism, others toward religious traditionalism, still others toward Zionism and the creation of a Jewish state. Throughout diaspora history, Jews didn't just react to external pressures. They also engaged in vigorous internal debates about theology, practice, community organization, relationship to modernity, and what it meant to be Jewish. These weren't minor disagreements about ritual details. These were fundamental debates about Jewish identity, purpose, and future. And they produced a variety of movements and approaches that reflected the diversity of diaspora experience. The Hasidic movement, emerging in 18th century Eastern Europe, represented one response to the challenges of exile. Founded by the Baal Shem Tov, Hasidism emphasized mysticism, emotional connection to God, joy in worship, and the importance of righteous leaders, tzaddikim or rebbes, who could intercede with the divine and guide their followers. It democratized Jewish spirituality, arguing that simple faith and heartfelt prayer could be as valuable as Talmudic scholarship. Traditional rabbinic authorities resisted, seeing Hasidism as threatening scholarship, rational thought, and established communal structures. The conflict was fierce, sometimes violent, with both sides claiming to represent authentic Judaism. Eventually, both traditions survived, creating the division between Hasidic and Mitnagdic, opponent Orthodox Judaism, that persists today. The rise of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, represented another internal development. While mystical traditions existed in Judaism for centuries, the expulsion from Spain and subsequent upheavals gave Kabbalah new urgency. Isaac Luria, in 16th century Safed, developed a mystical theology that tried to explain exile itself, cosmic rupture, divine sparks trapped in material shells, the mission of Jews to repair the broken world through proper observance. This gave profound meaning to diaspora suffering and Jewish practices, transforming them from mere law-keeping into participation in cosmic redemption. Secular Jewish movements emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, arguing that Jewish identity didn't require religious belief. Jewish socialism, Bundism, secular Yiddish culture, these movements maintained Jewish peoplehood while rejecting traditional religion. They created Yiddish schools, newspapers, theaters, political organizations that were thoroughly Jewish but completely secular. For them, being Jewish was about culture, history, shared struggle, not theology or ritual. Zionism itself began as an internal Jewish debate long before it became a political movement. Religious Jews had always prayed for return to Zion, but most saw this as something God would accomplish in messianic times, not something humans should pursue politically. Early Zionists were often secular, seeing Jewish nationalism as the solution to anti-Semitism and diaspora vulnerability. Religious Jews initially resisted, arguing that political Zionism was presumptuous, possibly heretical, certainly dangerous. These internal debates mattered because they reflected diaspora Jews actively shaping their own destiny rather than merely reacting to external forces. They were arguing about what Judaism should be, how Jews should live, what the future might hold. Some arguments were theological, some practical, some political, but all reflected communities grappling with the challenges and opportunities of modern life. The diversity of responses demonstrates that there was no single diaspora experience. A Hasidic shtetl in Poland, a Reformed temple in Berlin, a secular Yiddish theater in New York, a traditional Sephardic community in Salonika, all were diaspora Judaism. But they looked and felt completely different. What united them was the shared history of exile, maintenance of some form of Jewish identity, and connection to the broader story of the Jewish people. If you remember mid-20th century religious debates in America, between fundamentalists and modernists, between those who wanted churches to embrace social change and those who wanted to maintain tradition, you'll recognize similar dynamics. Communities under pressure, in transition, debating whether adaptation means evolution or betrayal. The Jewish versions of these debates were particularly intense because the stakes included survival as a distinct people. For 19 centuries, Jews ended every Passover Seder with the same words, "Next year in Jerusalem." For most of those centuries, it wasn't a practical plan. It was a prayer, a hope, a way of maintaining connection to a homeland that existed more in memory and aspiration than in practical possibility. The longing for return permeated Jewish prayer and practice. Daily prayers faced Jerusalem. Prayers mentioned Zion, Jerusalem, the temple, the restoration of Israel. Wedding ceremonies included breaking a glass to remember the temple's destruction. Fast days commemorated the losses of exile. The entire structure of Jewish life maintained connection to the land even as generations lived and died never seeing it. This wasn't mere nostalgia. It was theological. God had promised the land to Abraham's descendants. The covenant was eternal. Exile was punishment for sins, but not permanent abandonment. Return was inevitable. If not in this generation, then the next. If not now, then in messianic times, when God would restore Israel, rebuild the temple, and bring redemption to the world. But messianic hope was passive. Jews were supposed to wait for divine intervention, not take political action to hasten redemption. Attempts to return en masse or rebuild the temple before messianic times were theologically problematic, possibly forbidden. The three oaths mentioned in the Talmud suggested that Jews shouldn't force the end times, shouldn't try to reclaim the land by force. So for most of diaspora history, return to Zion remained a spiritual longing rather than a political program. Some individuals made aliyah, immigration to Israel, for religious reasons, to live in the Holy Land, to be buried there, to study Torah in Jerusalem or Safed or Hebron. Small Jewish communities maintained continuous presence in the land, never numerous, often struggling, but keeping the connection alive. The messianic hope occasionally flared into false messianic movements. Sabbatai Zevi in the 17th century claimed to be the Messiah, gathered massive following across the diaspora, raised expectations of imminent return to Israel. When Ottoman authorities forced him to convert to Islam or die, and he converted, the movement collapsed in disillusionment and scandal. Similar false messiahs appeared periodically, exploiting hope and desperation, always disappointing their followers. What changed this passive hope into active political movement? Multiple factors converged in the 19th century. Modern nationalism was sweeping Europe. Italians, Greeks, Poles, others claiming the right to national self-determination, arguing that each people deserved its own state. Jews observed this, and some began thinking, if other peoples could claim national rights, why not Jews? Anti-Semitism, rather than decreasing with modernization and enlightenment, seemed to be intensifying. The Haskalah promise that integration and acculturation would lead to acceptance proved false. The Dreyfus affair in France, a Jewish army officer falsely accused of treason in what should have been the most emancipated, enlightened European nation, shocked many Jews into recognizing that anti-Semitism could persist even in modern, rational societies. The Russian pogroms of the 1880s killed thousands and demonstrated that Eastern European Jews faced ongoing violence and persecution with no protection from authorities. Hundreds of thousands emigrated, most to America, but some began considering whether a Jewish homeland might be the only real solution. Secular nationalism, socialist movements, romantic nationalism's emphasis on folk culture and ancestral lands. All these modern political currents influenced young Jews who were abandoning traditional religion but seeking new forms of Jewish identity. They wanted to be Jews, not through religion, but through nationality, culture, political identification. Theodor Herzl emerged as the catalyzing figure. An assimilated Austrian journalist, he witnessed the Dreyfus affair's anti-Semitic mobs and concluded that integration had failed. His 1896 pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, argued that Jews needed political sovereignty, an internationally recognized homeland where they could be the majority, control their own affairs, build their own society. This wasn't messianism, this was practical politics. Herzl wasn't particularly religious, didn't initially insist the homeland must be Palestine. Uganda was briefly considered, and his vision was thoroughly modern, secular, influenced by European nationalism. But he tapped into the ancient longing, channeled it into political organization, convened the first Zionist Congress in 1897, created the institutions that would eventually establish Israel. Not all Jews supported Zionism. Many religious Jews considered it presumptuous, forcing God's hand, possibly heretical. Many socialists thought it was a distraction from class struggle, that solving workers' oppression would solve anti-Semitism. Many assimilationists believed integration was working, and political Zionism would only confirm anti-Semitic accusations that Jews weren't loyal citizens. The debates were fierce, sometimes bitter, dividing families and communities. But events would prove Herzl tragically prophetic. The Holocaust demonstrated that diaspora Jews, no matter how integrated or successful, remained vulnerable to destruction. And the establishment of Israel in 1948 gave political reality to the 2,000-year-old prayer. Next year in Jerusalem became, for the first time since 70 CE, something Jews could actually accomplish. The transformation of Zionism from dream to political movement required more than Herzl's charisma and organizational genius. It required changing how Jews thought about themselves, from a religious community waiting for divine redemption to a national movement taking responsibility for its own fate. Early Zionism was predominantly secular, often socialist, committed to creating not just a Jewish homeland but a new kind of society. The pioneers, Halotzim, who began immigrating to Palestine in waves starting in the 1880s, imagined they were building not just a nation but a utopia. They would till the soil themselves, not depend on others' labor. They would speak Hebrew, a dead language they were reviving, not Yiddish or diaspora languages. They would be physically strong, agriculturally productive, self-sufficient, everything diaspora Jews supposedly weren't. This involved a complicated relationship with diaspora history. On one hand, Zionism claimed continuity with 2,000 years of longing for return. On the other hand, it often portrayed diaspora existence as shameful, passive, weak. Precisely what Zionism would overcome. The new Jew, they imagined, was explicitly contrasted with the old Jew of the shtetl or ghetto. This wasn't entirely fair to diaspora achievement or history, but it reflected the revolutionary energy of the movement. The early kibbutzim, communal agricultural settlements, embodied this vision. Property was held collectively. Labor was shared. Decisions made democratically. Children raised communally. This was socialism in practice, an attempt to create egalitarian society free from the hierarchies and injustices of Europe. It was also incredibly hard work in difficult conditions, maintained more by ideological commitment than economic rationality. Women's roles in early Zionism were complex. The movement promised equality. Women pioneers worked in fields alongside men, served in defense organizations, participated in political leadership. But traditional gender roles often reasserted themselves, and women found themselves pushed toward domestic work, even in supposedly egalitarian kibbutzim. Still, compared to traditional diaspora communities, Zionism offered women more opportunities for public participation and leadership. Hebrew's revival was perhaps Zionism's most extraordinary cultural achievement. Hebrew had been a liturgical and literary language for centuries, but not a spoken vernacular. Ben Yehuda and others insisted that a Jewish nation needed a Jewish language, not the hodgepodge of diaspora tongues. They created modern Hebrew vocabulary for everything from agriculture to technology, taught children in Hebrew schools, published Hebrew newspapers and books. Within a generation, Hebrew became a living language again, something unprecedented in linguistic history. But Zionism faced enormous practical challenges. The land they sought was part of the Ottoman Empire, later under British mandate. It was inhabited by Arab Palestinians who had their own connection to the land and their own national aspirations. How to reconcile Jewish return with Palestinian Arab presence became an increasingly difficult question that Zionism never adequately resolved. Early Zionists varied in their approach. Some imagined cooperation, mutual benefit, economic development that would improve conditions for all. Others prioritized exclusively Jewish labor and land purchase, minimizing interaction with Arab populations. Few fully grasped or acknowledged that establishing a Jewish majority in Palestine would necessarily displace and threaten the Arab majority already there. This failure to honestly confront the conflict between Jewish and Palestinian national claims created problems that persist to this day. The British Balfour Declaration in 1917 expressed support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, giving Zionism international legitimacy. But it also promised not to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities, a contradiction the British never resolved and eventually abandoned by turning the problem over to the United Nations. The 1930s and 40s saw desperate Jewish immigration as Nazi persecution, and then the Holocaust made Zionism's warnings about diaspora vulnerability horrifyingly real. Britain tried to limit Jewish immigration precisely when it became most necessary, creating the tragic situation of refugees being turned away from Palestine while millions died in Europe. The contradiction between British promises to Jews and Arabs, between international sympathy for Holocaust survivors and commitment to limiting immigration, between Zionist determination and Palestinian resistance, set the stage for the conflict that would erupt in 1948. Those of you who remember the late 1940s remember the newsreels, ships like the Exodus carrying Holocaust survivors being turned away, the UN partition plan, the British withdrawal, the declaration of Israeli independence in May 1948, and the immediate war that followed. You remember the grainy footage of David Ben-Gurion reading the Declaration of Independence? The incredible fact that for the first time since 70 CE, Jews had political sovereignty, an internationally recognized state. The price was high: immediate war with surrounding Arab states, the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs in what they call the Nakba catastrophe, the beginning of a conflict that remains unresolved. Zionism achieved its goal of establishing a Jewish state, but at a cost in Palestinian suffering that many early Zionists hadn't anticipated, and that continues to complicate Israel's moral and political position. The waves of Aliyah, immigration to Israel, weren't a single event but multiple movements across decades, each with distinct character, motivated by different circumstances, bringing different populations with different dreams and challenges. The first Aliyah, 1882 to 1903, brought primarily Russian and Romanian Jews fleeing pogroms and poverty. These were the idealists, the pioneers who established the first agricultural settlements, who literally drained swamps and planted orchards, transforming themselves from urban merchants and craftsmen into farmers. The mortality rate was high. Malaria killed many. The Ottoman authorities were suspicious. Local Arab populations were sometimes hostile. Economic viability was questionable, but they persisted, sustained by ideology and desperation. The second Aliyah, 1904 to 1914, brought more socialists and labor Zionists. These were the founders of the kibbutz movement, the political organizers who would eventually lead the state. David Ben-Gurion arrived during this period. These immigrants were more politically sophisticated, more committed to creating specifically Jewish labor and building class-free society. They also revived Hebrew more successfully than earlier immigrants, insisting on using it in daily life, not just prayer. The third Aliyah, 1919 to 1923, came after World War I and the Balfour Declaration. These immigrants brought more diverse skills, not just agricultural workers, but professionals, tradespeople, the beginning of urban development. Tel Aviv, founded in 1909, began growing from a neighborhood into a city. The Jewish population in Palestine reached about 85,000 by 1923. The fourth and fifth Aliyah waves, 1924 to 1939, included many middle-class European Jews fleeing economic depression and rising anti-Semitism. These weren't necessarily Zionist ideologues. Many were pragmatic refugees seeking safety and opportunity. They brought capital, professional expertise, European culture. They built the infrastructure of what would become Israel: businesses, cultural institutions, universities, hospitals. The Hebrew University opened in Jerusalem in 1925. Haifa developed as a major port. The 1930s saw increasing desperation as Nazi persecution intensified. Jews trying to flee Europe faced closed doors almost everywhere. The United States had strict quotas. Britain limited Palestine immigration through the 1939 White Paper, owing to Arab pressure and strategic concerns about maintaining Middle East stability. This created the terrible situation where Jews desperate to escape Nazi Germany had nowhere to go. Illegal immigration, Aliyah Bet, became necessary. Zionist organizations smuggled refugees into Palestine on overcrowded ships, evading British blockades. The Exodus in 1947, carrying Holocaust survivors, was intercepted and turned back in a public relations disaster for Britain that helped turn international opinion towards supporting a Jewish state. The message was clear: Jews had nowhere else to go. If Palestine was closed, they had no refuge. The Holocaust itself, of course, prevented millions from ever having the chance to immigrate. 6 million dead meant 6 million who would never see Jerusalem, never participate in building the state, never escape diaspora. The survivors who did reach Palestine after 1945 carried trauma beyond description, entire families murdered, communities annihilated, every certainty destroyed. Israel's establishment in 1948 came too late for most European Jews, but it came in time for Jews from Arab lands. Between 1948 and 1952, approximately 700,000 Jews from Middle Eastern and North African countries, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Egypt, Morocco, immigrated to Israel. Some came enthusiastically, fulfilling religious longing. Others were forced out by rising Arab nationalism and anti-Jewish violence following Israel's establishment. Ancient communities that had existed for 2,000 years, that predated Islam, that had survived through centuries, suddenly became unsustainable. Operation Magic Carpet brought nearly 50,000 Yemenite Jews by airlift. Operation Ezra and Nehemiah brought Iraqi Jews. North African Jews arrived in waves through the 1950s and 60s. These Mizrahi and Sephardic immigrants transformed Israel's character, adding Middle Eastern and North African culture to the predominantly European Ashkenazi population that had founded the state. The absorption wasn't always smooth. European Jews ran the government and institutions. They sometimes looked down on Middle Eastern and North African Jews as less modern, less educated, less European. Immigrants were sent to development towns in peripheral areas rather than central locations. Cultural discrimination persisted for decades. The promised equality didn't always materialize. These tensions, between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, between established Israelis and new immigrants, between European and Middle Eastern Jewish cultures, shaped Israeli society and politics for generations. Soviet Jews began arriving in large numbers after the 1970s, when emigration restrictions eased. These were often highly educated, doctors, engineers, scientists, musicians, but coming from atheist Soviet society, many had minimal connection to Jewish religion or tradition. They brought skills and knowledge, but also challenged what Israeli identity meant. Could you be Jewish and Israeli without religious observance? The answer was yes, but it complicated the relationship between religious and secular Jews within Israel. Ethiopian Jews, Beta Israel, arrived in dramatic airlifts in the 1980s and 90s, bringing one of Judaism's oldest and most isolated communities. They'd maintained Jewish practice in Ethiopia for perhaps 2,000 years, completely separate from mainstream Judaism, following traditions that predated Talmudic development. Their arrival raised questions about Jewish identity. They looked different, practiced differently, had different cultural norms. Israeli rabbinate, initially questioned their Jewish status, requiring formal conversion for some, creating resentment and complications. Each Aliyah wave brought challenges alongside opportunities: language barriers, cultural conflicts, economic competition, housing shortages, employment difficulties. Integrating multiple diaspora traditions into one nation proved messy, incomplete, ongoing. The Zionist dream of Jews from across the diaspora returning to build a unified nation faced the reality that 2,000 years of separate development had created vastly different Jewish cultures. Those of you who remember America in the 1940s and 50s, when immigration was transforming cities, when ethnic neighborhoods maintained distinct identities while gradually Americanizing, might recognize similar dynamics. The melting pot wasn't smooth or instant. It required generations, created tensions, involved both loss of distinct traditions and creation of something new. Israel's law of return, granting automatic citizenship to any Jew, embodied the Zionist principle that Israel was the homeland for all Jews. But it also raised questions: who counts as Jewish? Matrilineal descent only? Converts? People with one Jewish grandparent? These weren't abstract theological questions. They determined who could find refuge, claim citizenship, participate in building the state. The ongoing Aliyah continues today, though in smaller numbers and different character. Jews from France escaping rising antisemitism. Latin American Jews seeking economic opportunity and Jewish community. Americans, Canadians, South Africans making Aliyah by choice rather than necessity. The waves continue, each adding to the complex mosaic that is modern Israel. The promise of return, maintained through 2 millennia of exile, achieved reality. But the reality proved more complicated, more challenging, less utopian than the dreams that sustained it. Return wasn't the end of Jewish history. It was a new chapter with its own conflicts, questions, and transformations. Modern Israel, 77 years after its founding, is something neither early Zionists nor traditional religious Jews quite imagined. It's a democracy, messy, argumentative, polarized, but functioning. It's a technological powerhouse, more startups per capita than almost anywhere, leading in cybersecurity, medical technology, water management. It's culturally vibrant. Hebrew literature, film, music, theater thriving in ways that would astonish the pioneers who struggled to revive the language. But it's also deeply divided. Religious and secular Jews argue about the role of Judaism in a Jewish state. Should buses run on Sabbath? Should the state fund religious education? Should religious courts control marriage and divorce? These aren't abstract questions. They affect daily life, determine personal freedom, shape what kind of society Israel becomes. The ultra-Orthodox Haredim maintain separate communities with minimal engagement in secular Israeli society. High birth rates mean they're a growing percentage of the population. Many study Torah full-time rather than working, receiving state subsidies, exempted from military service. This creates resentment from secular Israelis who serve in the military, pay taxes, and see Haredim as not contributing while benefiting from the state. Religious Zionists, modern Orthodox, try to balance tradition and modernity, serving in military, participating in economy and politics, but maintaining strict observance. They're often the settlers in West Bank, motivated by religious claims to the land, complicating peace negotiations. Their vision of Israel as fulfilling biblical promises conflicts with pragmatic security concerns and Palestinian rights. Secular Israelis, perhaps the largest group, want Israel to be a normal country, democratic, Western-oriented, where Judaism is background heritage rather than governing principle. They resent religious coercion, want separation of religion and state, envision Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, but not a theocracy. The military, the IDF, serves as the great integrator and divider. Universal conscription, except for Haredim and most Arabs, creates shared experience across class and ethnic lines. Everyone serves, everyone knows someone who died in service, everyone understands the security threats are real. This creates social cohesion but also means Israeli society is perpetually militarized, security-focused in ways that can override other concerns. Arab citizens, about 20% of Israel's population, occupy a complicated position. They're citizens with voting rights, representation in parliament, theoretically equal under law. But they're also Palestinians living in a state that defines itself as Jewish, fighting wars against Arab countries, where the national anthem speaks of Jewish souls yearning. Many identify as Palestinian Israelis, maintaining Palestinian identity while participating in Israeli democracy. The tension is inherent and unresolved. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict casts a shadow over everything. The occupation of West Bank and Gaza since 1967, the ongoing security threats, the failure to reach peace agreement, the settlements, the barrier wall, the violence on both sides. These shape Israeli politics, society, international image. Different Israelis see it completely differently. Right-wing Israelis emphasize security needs, Palestinian terrorism, historical Jewish claims to the land, rejection of peace offers. Left-wing Israelis emphasize occupation's moral cost, Palestinian suffering, long-term unsustainability, necessity of territorial compromise. Most Israelis just want security and normalcy, to raise families, build careers, not worry about missiles or suicide bombers. But geography and history make that difficult. The conflict isn't going away, and every generation of Israelis grapples with the same questions their parents and grandparents faced. Still, Israel has achieved things that seemed impossible. It's a functioning democracy in a region of autocracies. It's economically prosperous despite constant security challenges. It's absorbed millions of immigrants from over 100 countries and created a shared national culture. Hebrew went from dead language to living vernacular in 3 generations. Unprecedented in linguistic history. Israeli technology contributes globally to medicine, agriculture, communications, water management. The cultural achievement is remarkable. Israeli literature, produced in a language that was liturgical a century ago, wins international prizes. Israeli film is internationally recognized. Israeli music blends influences from across the diaspora, Yemenite, Moroccan, Russian, European, American, into something distinctive. The food is similarly hybrid. Falafel and hummus adopted from Arab culture, Eastern European dishes, fusion cuisine that didn't exist before. But identity questions remain unresolved. What does it mean to be Israeli? Is it Jewish identity, national identity, cultural identity, or some combination? Can Arab citizens be fully Israeli if Israel defines itself as the Jewish state? How do you balance Jewish values with democratic principles when they conflict? Can religious and secular Jews continue coexisting in one state when they want fundamentally different societies? The generational divide is significant. Younger Israelis, born into statehood, take it for granted in ways their grandparents who built it couldn't. The Holocaust feels more distant. The miracle of Israel's establishment seems less miraculous, more mundane. They criticize government, military, religious establishment in ways earlier generations couldn't because survival was never assured. This is healthy democracy, but also loss of founding idealism. Some young Israelis leave Yerida, descent, the opposite of Aliyah. They go to America, Europe, seeking economic opportunity or escape from military service or political frustration. This is controversial. After 2,000 years of diaspora, after establishing the state specifically as Jewish homeland, leaving feels like betrayal. But it also demonstrates that Israel is a normal country now, and normal countries have emigration as well as immigration. Those of you who've watched America change over your lifetimes, who've seen the founding generation's idealism challenged by later generations, who've grappled with how societies change while trying to maintain core values, you'll recognize these dynamics. Every nation founded on ideological principles eventually faces the challenge of maintaining those principles while adapting to changed circumstances. Here's something that would have shocked early Zionists. The largest Jewish population in the world isn't in Israel. It's in the United States, about 6.3 million compared to Israel's 7.2 million. After 2,000 years of exile, after the Holocaust, after Israel's establishment, most Jews still live in diaspora by choice. American Jews particularly represent successful diaspora integration. They're disproportionately educated, economically successful, politically engaged, culturally influential. They've achieved levels of acceptance and success that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of diaspora Jews. Anti-Semitism exists, but is socially unacceptable in most contexts. Jews serve in government, business, academia, arts, every field, without the restrictions that limited earlier diaspora populations. This success raises questions Zionism was meant to answer. If diaspora Jews can be safe, prosperous, and maintain Jewish identity in democratic countries, what's the argument for Aliyah? Why should an American Jew uproot family and career to move to Israel with its security challenges and political complexities? Different Jews answer differently. Some maintain strong connection to Israel. They visit regularly, donate to Israeli causes, follow Israeli politics, consider Israel central to Jewish identity even while living elsewhere. Others engage minimally, seeing Judaism as personal religion and cultural heritage, rather than national identity requiring connection to a specific land. Still others criticize Israel actively, arguing its policies contradict Jewish values, that occupation and Palestinian treatment represent moral failure. Intermarriage rates in America exceed 50%, meaning most Jews marrying today choose non-Jewish partners. This represents either assimilation's ultimate triumph or Judaism's evolution, depending on perspective. Children of intermarriage may or may not identify as Jewish, may or may not be raised with Jewish education and community. Demographers debate whether American Jewish population will decline significantly over coming generations. European Jewish communities face different challenges. The Holocaust destroyed most of European Jewry. Communities that had existed for centuries simply gone. Post-war European Jewry is smaller, more fragile. Recent years have seen rising anti-Semitism, attacks on synagogues, Jews leaving France for Israel or elsewhere due to security concerns. The specter of European Jewish history haunts contemporary European Jews in ways American Jews don't always understand. Latin American Jewish communities, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, maintain vibrant traditions but face economic instability and occasional anti-Semitism. Some make Aliyah, seeking security and opportunity. Others maintain strong diaspora communities, contributing to their countries while preserving Jewish identity. Jewish communities in Muslim countries, once numbering over 800,000, have mostly disappeared. The ancient Iraqi, Yemenite, Egyptian, Moroccan Jewish communities exist now primarily in Israel or diaspora. Their centuries of history in Muslim lands ended. This represents one of recent history's least discussed refugee crises, comparable in numbers to Palestinian refugees, but receiving far less attention. Contemporary diaspora faces challenges ancient communities couldn't have imagined. Intermarriage rates, assimilation pressures, declining religious observance, particularly among younger generations. Jewish literacy, ability to read Hebrew, knowledge of tradition and texts, is far lower than historical norms. Many Jews maintain ethnic/cultural identity while abandoning religious practice entirely. But new forms of Jewish identity emerge. Jewish cultural festivals, Yiddish language revivals, Jewish food movements, Jewish meditation and spirituality combining tradition with contemporary interests. Some Jews find community through social justice work grounded in Jewish values rather than religious observance. Others engage through Jewish philanthropy, supporting Israel or Jewish causes while living fully integrated lives otherwise. Technology has transformed diaspora experience. Jews worldwide can video call Israel instantly, follow Israeli news in real time, maintain connections across continents that earlier generations couldn't imagine. Digital resources make Jewish education accessible. Torah commentary, Jewish philosophy, Hebrew lessons all available online. Virtual communities form around shared interests or concerns, yet something is also lost. The intense community cohesion that came from physical proximity, shared challenges, limited interaction with outside world, that's largely gone for most diaspora Jews. The separateness that maintained identity through centuries exists today mostly by choice, not necessity. And choices can change generation to generation. The relationship between diaspora Jews and Israel is complicated, often fraught. Many diaspora Jews feel deep connection, see Israel as the center even while choosing not to live there. Others resent Israeli expectation that real Jewish life requires aliyah, that diaspora is somehow second class. Israeli and diaspora Jews sometimes struggle to understand each other. Israelis see American Jews as naive about security threats. Americans see Israelis as too militaristic and right-wing. But connection persists. Birthright trips bring young diaspora Jews to Israel, creating personal connection to the land and the conflict. Jewish organizations worldwide fundraise for Israeli causes. Crises in Israel mobilize diaspora support. The sense that Jews worldwide share responsibility for each other, Kol Yisrael Avim Ze Bazeh, all Israel is responsible for one another, continues from ancient tradition into modern reality. Perhaps most remarkably, diaspora continues to create Jewish culture. American Jewish writers, filmmakers, comedians, thinkers contribute distinctively Jewish perspectives to broader culture. The anxious, neurotic Jewish intellectual, the social justice Jewish activist, the secular but culturally Jewish artist. These types exist because diaspora created space for Jews to engage with broader culture while maintaining distinct identity. The question facing contemporary Jewry is whether this can last. Can Jews maintain distinct identity without the pressures that forced earlier generations to maintain boundaries? Can religion survive as purely voluntary, purely personal, when competing with infinite other options? Can the Jewish people survive success, prosperity, acceptance in ways they survived persecution, poverty, rejection? Nobody knows. History provides no precedent for this situation. Jews accepted and successful in powerful democracies, with their own state existing simultaneously, with technology connecting worldwide community, with complete freedom to assimilate or maintain identity as they choose. So what do we make of this story? What does 2,000 years of diaspora experience teach us about identity, community, survival, resilience? First, it demonstrates that national identity doesn't require territory. For 19 centuries, Jews maintained themselves as a people without a homeland, without political sovereignty, without the usual markers of nationhood. They did it through text, law, practice, communal bonds, and sheer stubborn refusal to disappear. This is unprecedented in human history. Every other ancient people either died out or assimilated. Jews maintained distinct identity across time spans that erased empires. The mechanism matters. It wasn't passive. It required active transmission, teaching every generation, maintaining institutions, preserving texts, enforcing communal boundaries. It wasn't rigid. Different diaspora communities adapted to local circumstances while maintaining core identity. And it wasn't merely ethnic converts joined. Intermarriage happened, but Jewish identity was maintained through cultural and religious practice rather than mere ancestry. Second, diaspora demonstrates both persecution's pattern and its limits. Jews faced repeated violence and expulsion over 2 millennia. The pattern is depressingly consistent. Integration followed by resentment, followed by scapegoating, followed by violence. Understanding this pattern helps explain why Israel's establishment seemed necessary to many Jews. If history teaches anything, it's that being a vulnerable minority can become catastrophically dangerous. Yet persecution has limits. It couldn't destroy the Jewish people. Not Babylonian exile, not Roman dispersion, not medieval expulsions, not even industrial-scale Nazi murder. The stubborn persistence of Jewish identity despite everything thrown against it suggests something powerful about human capacity to maintain meaning and purpose against impossible odds. Third, the diaspora experience shaped Jewish values and culture in ways that continue influencing the world. The emphasis on education, literacy, textual study, this came from diaspora necessity and created intellectual culture that contributed far beyond Jewish communities. Jewish overrepresentation in science, medicine, law, arts, social justice movements isn't biological. It's cultural, rooted in values developed over centuries of diaspora experience. The prophetic tradition, speaking truth to power, demanding justice for the vulnerable, insisting that society be judged by how it treats its weakest members. This is deeply Jewish and profoundly influential on Western moral and political thought. It came partly from being outsiders, from experiencing vulnerability, from maintaining ethical traditions that could critique surrounding societies. The emphasis on argument, multiple perspectives, wrestling with text and tradition rather than accepting simple answers. The Talmudic method shaped Jewish intellectual culture and influences anyone trained in that tradition. The comfort with complexity, ambiguity, disagreement within shared framework. This is diaspora's gift to intellectual life. Fourth, diaspora teaches that identity is maintained through active choice and community support. Jewish identity didn't persist automatically. It required institutions, education, communal pressure, individual commitment. When those weakened, assimilation followed. This suggests that any identity or tradition requiring transmission across generations needs similar structures, commitment, community support. It also suggests that success and acceptance can threaten identity differently than persecution. Persecution forced boundaries, made identity obvious and necessary. Success allows assimilation, makes identity optional. Contemporary diaspora faces this challenge, maintaining Jewish identity when it brings few obligations and endless alternatives compete for attention, commitment, identity. Fifth, the creation of Israel represents both fulfillment and complication. 2,000 years of longing achieved reality. Jews have sovereignty, self-determination, the ability to defend themselves, a homeland where they're the majority. This is extraordinary achievement, the impossible made real. But it comes with costs and contradictions. The conflict with Palestinians remains unresolved. The occupation contradicts Jewish values for many Jews. The type of society Israel becomes, religious or secular, democratic or Jewish, peace-seeking or security-obsessed, divides Israelis and diaspora Jews. The dream achieved doesn't match the dream imagined. Those of you who served in World War II, Korea, or Vietnam understand something about this. The distance between ideals that justify conflict and messy realities on the ground. The noble cause doesn't eliminate moral complexity, hard choices, consequences that trouble conscience. Israel faces this continuously, and there's no simple answer. Finally, the Jewish story poses questions relevant beyond Jews themselves. How do minority communities maintain identity while integrating into broader society? When does adaptation become assimilation? What obligations do successful diaspora communities have to their homeland? How do refugees maintain connection to places they've left? How do people navigate multiple, sometimes conflicting identities? These aren't just Jewish questions. Immigrants worldwide face them. Ethnic minorities grapple with them. Anyone trying to maintain tradition in modern secular society confronts similar challenges. The Jewish experience, because it spanned so long and involved such dramatic circumstances, offers a case study in identity maintenance, community resilience, cultural persistence, and perhaps most fundamentally, what makes a people. Jews maintained peoplehood without territory for 19 centuries. They did it through culture, tradition, text, community, shared memory, and future orientation. They created portable homeland that survived empires, outlasted persecutors, adapted to circumstances that should have destroyed them. This suggests that identity, purpose, meaning can persist through anything if communities commit to maintaining them, if institutions support transmission, if individuals choose to carry forward what previous generations handed down. It's not automatic, not easy, not guaranteed, but it's possible. The diaspora story isn't over. Israel exists, but diaspora continues. Most Jews still live outside Israel by choice. New challenges face both Israeli and diaspora communities. How the story continues depends on choices made by this generation and the next. But 2,000 years of persistence suggests betting against Jewish continuity would be unwise. They've survived everything history threw at them. They've maintained identity through impossible circumstances. They've contributed to the world out of proportion to their numbers. They've wrestled with their traditions, argued with their God, debated every aspect of their identity, while never quite letting it go. And in that stubbornness, that refusal to disappear, that determination to remain distinct while engaging with the world, that commitment to passing something precious from one generation to the next, in all of that, there's something worth honoring, worth learning from, worth remembering. The odyssey of Jewish diaspora communities, from the Babylonian exile through Roman dispersion, medieval persecutions, modern transformations, and finally return, represents one of history's most remarkable stories of human resilience and cultural persistence. It's a story about loss and survival, about maintaining identity without homeland, about the power of text and tradition and community to sustain a people across inconceivable spans of time. It's about adaptation and resistance, integration and separation, the delicate balance between engaging with the world and remaining distinct from it. It's also a story about price. The persecutions, expulsions, violence, discrimination, these weren't incidental. They were constant features of diaspora experience. The Holocaust represents not an aberration but a culmination, industrial technology applied to ancient hatred. 6 million dead because being Jewish in the wrong place at the wrong time meant death. And yet they endured. They survived. They maintained themselves through sheer determination, through institutions that preserved knowledge and community, through families that taught children, through individuals who chose to identify as Jewish even when abandoning it would have been easier. The establishment of Israel in 1948 gave political reality to 2,000 years of longing. It provided refuge, sovereignty, self-defense capability. It allowed Jews to be majority rather than minority, to control their own destiny, to build society according to their own values and visions. This achievement shouldn't be minimized. It's extraordinary, unprecedented, the fulfillment of what seemed impossible. But Israel's establishment didn't end Jewish history or resolve all questions. It created new challenges between Israelis and Palestinians, between religious and secular Jews, between different visions of what Jewish state should mean. Diaspora continues not from necessity, but choice, raising questions about identity, connection, obligation that earlier generations didn't face. The legacy of exile continues shaping Jewish identity worldwide. The experience of being outsiders, of vulnerability, of maintaining tradition against pressure, these remain part of Jewish consciousness even for Jews born into acceptance and prosperity. The memory of persecution, the knowledge that it can recur, the commitment to never again, these drive policies and attitudes that sometimes conflict with other Jewish values. For those of you watching who lived through World War II, who remember when anti-Semitism was respectable, who witnessed the Holocaust's revelation and Israel's establishment, you've seen Jewish history's most dramatic transformation. The world you were born into, when Jews were powerless minorities almost everywhere, isn't the world we have now. That change happened in your lifetime. Consider what that means. For Jews today, the challenge is honoring this history while building future. How do you maintain identity earned through such suffering without being defined entirely by it? How do you remember persecution without becoming paralyzed by fear? How do you celebrate Israeli achievement while acknowledging its moral complexities? How do you remain distinct while participating fully in broader society? These questions don't have simple answers. Different Jews answer differently, and that's okay. The tradition of argument, multiple perspectives, wrestling with questions rather than settling for simple answers, that's as Jewish as anything else. But perhaps the core lesson is this: identity, tradition, community are maintained through choice, commitment, and transmission. They don't persist automatically. They require individuals choosing to participate, to learn, to teach the next generation, to maintain institutions and practices that connect past to future. The Jewish people survived 2,000 years of exile because enough Jews in enough generations chose to remain Jewish, to pass it forward, to maintain something precious even when it cost them. That chain of transmission, unbroken across impossible circumstances, is the real miracle. Whether it continues depends on choices being made now and in coming generations. The external pressures that once forced Jewish identity have largely disappeared for most Jews. What remains is choice, which is both freedom and burden. The story of Jewish diaspora, the odyssey from exile to homeland, isn't really finished. It continues in Israel's development, in diaspora communities' evolution, in the choices of individuals deciding what Jewish identity means to them. The journey goes on. But looking back across 2 millennia, seeing what was preserved, what was created, what was survived, there's something profoundly moving about it. A people who refused to disappear, who maintained themselves through everything history threw at them, who contributed to civilization out of all proportion to their numbers, who turned exile into culture and suffering into meaning. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider that. Consider the power of transmission, of teaching one generation to the next. Consider the resilience of identity maintained through choice. Consider communities that survived empires by knowing who they were and refusing to forget. Their story is particular, unique, Jewish, but the themes resonate universally. Persistence in adversity, identity maintenance, cultural transmission, the stubborn human refusal to be erased. And perhaps there's comfort in that, in knowing that people have faced impossible circumstances and somehow persisted. That traditions can survive anything if enough people commit to carrying them forward. That exile, loss, dispersion aren't necessarily permanent. That return, after even 2,000 years, remains possible. In Hebrew, there's a phrase, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. After everything, that remains true. They lived through Babylon and Rome, through medieval Christendom and Islamic empires, through pogroms and Holocaust. They lived in exile and they've returned home. They live in Israel and they live in diaspora. They continue, and in that continuation, that refusal to disappear, that maintenance of something precious across time, there's a lesson worth carrying forward. Whether you're Jewish or not, whether you care about this particular story, or see it as a reflection of larger human patterns. The journey from exile to homeland took 2,000 years, but the journey continues still, in choices made daily by individuals and communities trying to honor the past while building the future. May we all find that kind of persistence in what matters to us. May we all pass forward something precious to the next generation. And may we all remember that identity, tradition, and meaning are maintained through commitment, not accident, through choice, not inevitability. Asterisk, if tonight's journey stirred memories, whether of family stories about the old country or your own experiences with community and tradition, or thoughts about identity and belonging, I'd be honored if you shared them below. Your generation holds perspectives that matter, stories that deserve telling, wisdom earned through decades of watching history unfold. The comment section is yours. Now rest well, let these thoughts settle, and know that you've traveled with me through one of history's most remarkable stories, the impossible persistence of a people who simply refuse to vanish. Until next time, good night.